All right, so now we have in 1928, Stalin had succeeded by successfully alienated and marginalized Trotsky, won the election in the Politburo, and now he immediately begins to consolidate power. How does he do it? Well, first thing he does is develop his 5 year plans. Well, sorry about that. Let me back up. I do want to point out Dr. McKay talks about the nationalities. And really, he begins to kind of super centralize the state, removing any autonomy that maybe Lenin has given him. But I do want to point out that Lenin probably never had game plan of respecting the autonomy of these other peoples. Lenin was attempting, he was an opportunist trying to maintain a sense of power. I do believe Stalin is no different than Lenin. But we see that. But I do want to talk about the 5 year plan. This is the first 5 year plan. He's going to have several 5 year plans all the way through to his death in 1953. And the 5 year plans are always, these are going to be, Stalin establishes an economic game plan in which he alone established the industrial goals. It's going for every 5 years. And he's going to base it on state sponsored rapid industrialization. And right now, you may be like, "Hey, whoa, Wass, what just happened here?" He was supporting the NEP. Well, he supported the NEP until he didn't have to any longer, and he turned it, and now he's trying to convince the people that yes, we need in the NEP so that we can show the world the greatness of socialism. So he's beginning to kind of bounce on this idea of socialism in one country, and he's like, "All right, this is what we're going to do," and his these were dramatic goals and they were established, and bureaucrats, they're obliged to fulfill them. I do want to point out there is not going to be any opportunity for a bureaucrat to fail. If a bureaucrat fails, a bureaucrat is a partisan, Soviet political member who has been appointed into these positions to achieve a number of still output or development of rails or the organization of cities. And there's never going to be anyone who says, wait a minute, this is too much. If there is, which there may have been one or two, they're going to be sent to Siberia for a vacation, get away in the gulags, not somewhere you wanted to go. So I want to point out these 5 year plans, absolutely astonishing. They really do illustrate we begin to see this excessive increase in heavy industrial output, really successful number wise. Little side note, not that practical on the reality side. Much of this produce was based on numbers, not practicality. So it was all about trying to show the world that in the face of the depression, the Soviet Union is a Soviet communist utopia. I promise you it's not somewhere you wanted to live. I love this image. You see propaganda here about trying to bring them together. And my last little statement about the 5 year plans before we get to collectivization is to pay for this infrastructure, Stalin is going to depend on grain exports. That's going to be really important on our next slide. So the first 5 year plan, heavy industrial goals, still output, rail output. It's really about the development of industrial cities, and it's not going to be about consumer goods. It's not going to be about the need of the workers. It's all about trying to create an element of success. And part of the first 5 year plan was this policy of collectivization. Collectivization was in which all farms were going to be centralized under state authority. What happened to the Neppers? What happened to the kulaks? Well, as the Soviets seized all these farms and began to oversee agricultural production, the kulaks are going to be replaced. And the kulaks, when they resisted, they actually became enemies of the state. These were the successful farmers of the NEP. Sometimes we call them Neppers. And these kulaks were like, wait a minute, we're the successful farmers. We're the reason why Russia is producing food. Well, Stalin's like, well, that's cool, but you're a private ownership. And they began to create propaganda that said the kulaks were creating food shortages. This is some propaganda. The kulaks are on the right here being alienated by the good Russian farmers. Really some interesting elements. But again, the kulaks are absolutely going to be sent to Siberia. They're going to be anyone who resisted Stalin's plan. And what we find out is it's really the Ukraine that saw the worst part here. We're going to talk about the Great Famine here. This is actually a product. The Great Famine of 1932-33 was a state-sponsored, state-created famine directed towards really the Ukrainians. Here we see an author, Anne Applebaum. She's a really famous historian, but here we see this is her latest book, Stalin's War in the Ukraine, the Red Famine. And she argues that collectivization, as it disrupted the agricultural system, yes, there's going to be a huge decline in agricultural product. And while this decline of the output, of agricultural output is happening, they're still maintaining grain exports. Well, this is why the Soviet Union faced this terrible Great Famine of 32-33. And the Ukrainians faced the harshest parts of it. The Ukrainians had been nationalists, they had been rebellious to a degree. We know that even in today's world, we know about the Ukraine. And Stalin believed that he needed to oppress them. So during this time period of this great famine, the Ukrainians are going to be systematically killed, really, through their withdrawal of this food. So they're farming on the steppe. They're very responsible for the previous increase in agricultural output. But now, because of collectivization, all that's going to be disrupted, and the Ukrainians are going to be disproportionately dying from this great famine. Again, I can't overstate the importance of this. This is the first 5-year plan. We've seen these dramatic increase in industrial output. At the same time, a massive famine, especially in Ukraine. Stalin's industrial cities, I think of, he needed to construct these industrial cities as part to manage the 5 years plans. And we see these two examples, Stalingrad and Magnitogorsk, and other cities are going to appear. They look like this one is Magnitogorsk. I can't say that word well. Sorry about that. But this is a really good example of what a Stalin-like city looks like. It's not pretty. Everything's standardized. All of this was produced very quickly, not very well built, not very well organized. And again, they're worried about numbers, worried about quantity rather than quality. Remember, all of this is being built at the exact same time the United States housing industry is collapsing during the Great Depression. So this was part of a plan to demonstrate to the world how great we were. Or when I say we, the Soviet Union, I'm sorry about that, but how great the Soviet Union was compared to the West. Once again, propaganda, really lots of lies there. The results of Stalinism, really, from 1937, workers could only buy 60% of what they could in 1928. Soviet policies of propaganda created a hope for the disillusioned. They provided old age pensions, free education, free healthcare, trying to demonstrate to people, yeah, your life sucks. Yes, your real wages are terrible, but at least you're Soviet, right? At least you have these free things. I think in the end, it's not as successful. Dr. McKay does talk a little bit about a new caste system. This class system is really where the upper class will be the Soviet communist leadership. The middle class is going to be the skilled workers. They're going to have access to so much more, while the lower classes, the working class, the unskilled class, as well as the farmers, really suffered the most. So that's the question mark there. I thought we were trying to get away from classes. Stalin is going to be utilizing this in hopes to create. So Stalinism is a little jacked up. Women in the 1920s, women had gained significant advances. Lenin is really going to focus on trying to satisfy the women because they're the ones that led the February Revolution. Remember that? So divorce was granted, abortion was granted, other emancipating policies. Unfortunately, this is actually going to see a decline in the birth rate, and it's going to create a population crisis at the exact worst time when that great famine occurs. This is why by the mid-1930s, Stalin had reversed many of the policies and created propaganda telling the Russian women they need to have more babies. So again, Stalinism it's going to have a unique element that's very different than what you and I would know. Soviet propaganda and Stalinism continues through. Socialist realism became the artistic style. Here we see a Soviet realist. This is a painting that's supposed to harken back to the revolution, where the peasants were being told of the revolutionary activities and a sense of excitement. Movies, we've already talked about Ivan the Terrible. There's going to be another illustrations of Peter the Great, and they're going to be all manipulated to create this through line that the great Russian czars are that are connected to Stalin. Stalin is the legacy of those guys. Then we have this Museum of the Atheism, which I love this image here. This is what a museum of an atheist looks like. We have these images of these, he can say some saints, but all of this is going to be really connected to the criticisms of the church. There's maybe a story like Copernicus, the great Polish, remember Poland is now Russia. The great Polish astronomer had been ridiculed and persecuted by the priests, so therefore Copernicus was not allowed to lead the progress. And Stalin really controlled the media in hopes of securing this cult of personality. Without him fully engaging, he still remained relatively quiet. So he's going to utilize propaganda to kind of demonstrate this illustration, kind of illustrate his greatness. He's going to create Father Russia, and all of this becomes exasperated and increased, amplified through the Great Patriotic War that we'll talk about in a few days. Now, let's talk about this Great Purge. The Great Purge was this horrible moment politically for Russians and military, in which Stalin is attempting to secure his power. He was paranoid. He was constantly paranoid. He feared people who were close to him. He believed people were constantly undermining him. This might date back to when he kind of was removed out of his leadership post by Lenin. And so what he's going to do, he's going to allow for a purge. This purge began in 1934. Sergei Kirov. Sergei Kirov was his protege, very close friend of Stalin. He was attractive, well-spoken, leader of the Politburo. And Stalin became paranoid that Kirov was challenging this authority. Doesn't appear that that's true, but regardless of that, we now have evidence since 1991. We've had access. We absolutely now know what occurred during this time period. In 1934, Sergei Kirov was chilling out, and the NKVD, or Stalin's secret police, NKVD, came in, seems to have killed Kirov, wrapped him up in a rug, carried him out, never to be seen again. And this is an important moment because this is a moment in 1934 that really ushered in this great fear, this great purge, this fear in which the Soviet political leadership was like, wait a minute, if he's gone, who's going to be next? And it really created this arbitrariness of Stalin. In 1936, the old Bolsheviks are going to be marginalized. These old Bolsheviks, these guys were Lenin's best friends that dated back to the turn of the century, and that they had been really big developers of the new Soviet system. Well, Stalin began to get nervous that these old Bolsheviks would use their experience to overthrow him. So he purged them. He had them drugged. They had him persecuted. They used torture, and then they had a series of what we call show trials. Show trials are these TV shows in which these trials are happening on. So it's going to happen in TV. It's going to be in the movie theater during newsreels, and these show trials are going to show these old Bolsheviks confessing one after another of being an enemy of the state. They're drugged. They're tortured. It's so clear what's been happening. These confessions are not real. They're manufactured. And the whole hope is that the torture would end and then they were executed. And, and by the end of 37, people are like, all right, so now we can move forward. But unfortunately, there was a series of this new 5-year plan was focused on military equipment. And some of the generals were like, wait a minute, we need other things. And by just asking the questions about, hey, can we get something different? That's when Stalin said, we'll think about it. And then the NKVD came and visited one after another. Between 5 to 10% of the Soviet military leadership is going to be completely wiped out in 1938. I want to point out this is the worst possible time. From 1934 to 1938, this great purge really is going to systematically remove experienced politicians and military leaders from key positions of power. As we begin our move towards World War II, the Great Purge is really going to weaken the system, and everything is going to be about Stalin himself. As we finish this up, the Soviet Union, I like this map. If you want to pause and look at it, really kind of shows you the different elements, the Trans-Siberian Railroad, the different elements that Stalin was really expanding on. And what we see here, yes, the Stalin's rule by 1938 has stabilized. There is no threat of revolution, no threat of counter-revolution. Good stuff for Stalin. The Soviet Union had successfully industrially developed. I think that's huge. There are significant numbers. I think there's a lot of weaknesses there too that you can get into, but ultimately it's undeniable that in the face of the Great Depression, the Soviet Union had developed its infrastructure. But light industry remained low, driving the standards of living even lower. People had no consumer goods to buy, so they worked 10 to 12 hours a day for literally nothing. They're making rubles, I guess, but nothing that they could really buy. Agricultural production fluctuated. We saw the Great Famine. There's a constant shortage of food, spiking prices. This is, again, not a great place. Collectivization, definitely F. And the Soviet Union was politically and militarily weakened on the eve of the Second World War. And we're going to see how all this unfolds from 39 into 41 as the Soviet Union makes some very clear follies. They make some errors in which they forge an alliance with Hitler, despite knowing that Hitler was anti-communist. Then they're going to be Stalin's going to be completely shocked when Hitler invaded, which was all part of Hitler's plan anyways. But I hope that makes sense. I'm going to pause here